Hello and welcome to What Would Jane Do? Today I'm joined by my podcast friend Kate McFarlane, who is sitting with Blendon in her Jane Austen outfit, for those of you who can see the video version of this. And today we're going to be talking about what would Jane do about leaderships, brackets, the Darcy Effect. Now, the reason we chose this is because it may not have escaped people's notice that we've had a summer of leadership changes, not only with the passing of Her Majesty, the Queen, and handing over to King Charles. That's one kind of leadership. But in politics, we've had a fair number of changes at the top in the UK.
We've had an embarrassment of riches, Julia.
Riches? We had Boris Johnson, then...
An embarrassment, anyway.
And now Rishi Sunak. Yeah. So we are talking about, rather than the party politics side of it, we're talking about leadership qualities. So all political complexions are welcome here. So first of all, I thought we'd go back in time, away from our troubled moment here, and actually go back to Jane Austen's time and ask what kind of leaders there were around. And I did a little quick think through who was around, and starting at the top. Kate, what do you make of the leaders in the sense of who was sitting on the throne at the time? We have George III and Prinny, the Prince Regent.
Yeah. What
kind of leaders were they? What was Jane dealing with there?
Well, actually, the people were very fond of George III. They understood he had periods of mental illness, but he was known as Farmer George. He really loved farming and talking about his pigs and things like that. He was, I think, Hanoverian. There were some sort of slurs about being Germanic and things like that. But, you know, he often declared himself to be, I was born in Britain, I am British, and sort of tried to get away from all that. So I think, like a lot of rulers at the time, he was quite detached, possibly, from the woes of the common man. But I think he was generally reasonably liked. And interestingly, the Prince Regent, who as the name suggests, was regent for a few months at least, when King George was sadly having his bouts with mental illness, was actually very well liked in his youth, a bit like the former prince that abdicated, Queen Elizabeth's uncle.
However many Edwards that was.
Yes, another Edward. But basically, yes, in his youth, the Prince Regent was very well liked because he was very handsome, and he remained throughout his life very genial, very fond of society, always giving parties. He was an amazingly sociable person. The only downside of that, of course, was parties cost money, and all his pet projects like Brighton Pavilion cost enormous amounts of money, so he was spending like there was no tomorrow. So he was a bit like the Kardashian of his day, I suppose.
I think that's quite a generous interpretation. I think that actually, and maybe that's what the more conservative of a small C Austen household thought, though we know that Jane Austen wasn't actually that keen on the Prince Regent.
No, she really didn't want to dedicate her book, and was kind of persuaded it would be a good idea, but I don't think she would have done if she'd actually been allowed to get out of it.
But there are a couple of things just to add into the mix there, that of course those of you who have watched Hamilton, that King George is Farmer George III, and I think the Hamilton characterization is nothing like the historic character at all. It's just a bit of fun. Fun. But he was part of the losing of the American colonies.
Yes, definitely. Yes, very rigid.
Also pro-slavery.
As most people were at the time.
Yeah, but still, let's remember this.
Yes.
And he did have going for him a fairly happy, steady marriage.
Yes, he did. Lots and lots and lots of children.
The Prince Regent didn't.
No.
So if you think Charles and Di had problems,
there's nothing new under the sun.
To the Prince Regent going on to be William, George the Fourth, isn't he?
George the Fourth, yeah.
It's his brother William who then takes over in 1830, but that's beyond Jane's lifetime. So we won't worry about that. Okay, so the kings and the prince, the issues about spending too much, but I don't think there was any serious doubt about. There were only very few people who didn't want a monarchy. If it's like now, there was a Republican sentiment amongst people like Tom Paine, who obviously starts off as a British man, but on the whole, the monarchy was accepted as just a sort of necessary part of the landscape.
Well, if you remember, we got rid of a king, and that didn't go so well for us. So I think having got rid of Charles I, people suddenly realised, better the devil you know, perhaps, because otherwise you might end up with Oliver Cromwell. And then they welcomed back Charles II with open arms, didn't they? So they had actually got rid of a king, tried the difference, and thought, oh, maybe not.
But they also got rid of James I, didn't they?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
Oh, James II.
Yeah.
Which one? James
II.
James II. Yes, sorry. I'm just anyway. So that's right. So we're not that stable, actually, as a country.
No, it's all a complete fallacy that any time in history has been particularly stable. And if you look at the amazingly turbulent times of Jane Austen's relatively short life, it's 4 decades you're talking about. Within those 4 decades, we lost a massive war with the Americans. France had the biggest revolution ever and executed their king. There were riots, there was revolution going on, and England itself was incredibly worried at that time, as soon as the French Revolution kicked off, that it could flood over the Channel, which wasn't that far away, and send England into enormous turmoil.
Okay, so we've talked about the king. Of course, in a constitutional monarchy, the big decisions actually happen within the government, though.
Yes.
So what kind of prime ministers were around during Jane's lifetime?
You had Pitt the Younger, following on from his father, who was prime minister not so far ago, and I think you wanted to highlight the assassination of Spencer Perceval.
Yes, another sign that things weren't that quiet at the top. So in 1812, it's the only assassination, fortunately, that we've had of a prime minister, but it took place actually in the lobby of the House of Commons, and a disgruntled man from Liverpool shot him and killed him. And then Lord Liverpool came in and took over the government. So it wasn't a huge, in terms of the politics carried on running, but it was also interesting. It came at the same moment, which I hadn't realized until recently when I was doing some research for a book I'm writing, that actually this is the same moment when they decide that the king isn't going to come back from his latest bout of madness, and that's when the regency becomes permanent. It's the 1811-1812 handover, and the Prince Regent remains Prince Regent for another decade, I think, until his father dies. So prime minister, it was a dangerous job being prime minister.
Very dangerous.
But mainly they were conservative. On the conservative side, they weren't reformers. So Jane, I don't think Jane would have been terribly impressed by the run of prime ministers. So Pitt did steer through the abolition of the slave trade.
Yeah, Pitt the Younger did an amazing amount in a very small space of time, and actually died of exhaustion, I think, because of the amount of bills he was trying to pass. And he did reform as much as he could, I think. It's always difficult to bring everybody with you.
He had a anti. I mean, yeah, okay.
Well, yes. There's various ways you could argue what is actually a reform and what is keeping the status quo going. I suppose a lot of prime ministers at the time would say, whatever else we do, let's keep things peaceful, or let's maintain what we've got. Let's not plunge us into economic ruin, or we've already had very expensive wars going on. Let's not rock the boat too much.
So Pitt the Younger, obviously the name gives the clue, is an example of a young man in the top job. And I think it's relevant to thinking about a current, looking forward, that so in Jane Austen's era, they had the example of a brilliant young man who became, partly through his family connections, but also his own talent, who became the prime minister, leader of the nation. And looking at today in the UK, we've had a sort of Tony Blair as a young prime minister coming in the 90s. Rishi Sunak, our new prime minister, is also very young. So I think Jane Austen would see a connection between that. We'll wait to see if Rishi Sunak really
let's hope he has enough time to get comfortable.
Don't exhaust yourself, Rishi. Yes. But in fact, when we think about history, it's not everybody can grasp the names of who were prime ministers at the time, but most people, if you stop them on the street, would be able to come up with the military leaders of the era, not least because one of them is on top of a great big column. The other is given gave his name to a famous kind of footwear.
Yes.
And then, of course, looking across the channel, we've got Napoleon as a sort of anti-hero style leader. So let's take the leadership qualities of each of those. Nelson died first, so let's take him first. What do you think of, if you could say the top 3 qualities of Nelson as a leader, what would you pick on?
I think Nelson was really interesting because he was kind of thrust into the Navy at a very young age. So it's not necessarily a career he chose himself. He was just told, you are going to join the Navy. And he was incredibly seasick as a young person and suffered terribly with that. And then became this lion, if you like, this massive celebrity for his many victories. And I think if you look at his strategy, it seemed to be go completely crazy and do the last thing that people would suspect any sensible strategist would do. And I think it was either the Battle of Trafalgar or something like that. There was a massive line of ships in front of him, and he just drove his fleet right through the middle of it, which you would never do tactically. But they were so amazed that he'd done it and got away with it. I think they were just stunned but it worked.
So I think if I was going to do 3 words, I think it's bravery, personal bravery, flair, this sort of brilliant flair for the unorthodox, and also a certain amount of sort of sexy daring do.
He inevitably had a lot of charisma, and he was feted everywhere he went. So obviously people thought of him as a massive hero. And I think he must have got on reasonably well with the people under his command. You have to bring people with you if you're doing dangerous things like that. So I think he was respected within the Navy, but definitely flair. He was well known for wearing a lot of his awards all over his person, and he refused, I think, to wear a plain coat when he was on his command ship, which is partly why he got killed eventually, because he didn't want to. It was seen then, nobody would think of wearing camouflage. It was, you stand out, the more the better as a commander, and you lead from the front. So there was none of this lions led by lambs fallacy, really, myth. It was well known that anyone who commanded the Navy or the Army put themselves in as much, if not more, danger than the men they commanded.
So the next famous military leader coming on is Wellington, who...
Yes, my favourite.
He made his name first for fighting for the East India Company in India. And he was Wellesley then, not Wellington. But he made his big name for himself, the fame that we know now, by pushing up through the peninsula. They call it the Peninsula Campaign. So clearing the Napoleonic troops out of Portugal, then out of Spain. He doesn't actually fight Napoleon until the Battle of Waterloo, which is in 1815. But he does reverse the tide from the western side of this conflict. We mustn't forget there's lots of things happening over in Russia at this time. If you've read War and Peace, you know what we're talking about. But certainly the Peninsula Campaign, a lot of it is down to Wellington's leadership. So thinking of, for Nelson was daring do, unorthodox, bravery, flair. What would you say was Wellington's top 3 words to describe him?
Authoritative, organized, and strategy. He was very, very good. I think one of the things that people don't think about Wellington automatically, but made such a difference to his men, was he was absolutely wonderful at supply chains, which doesn't sound very sexy when you're talking about battles. But my golly, you see the army desert if they don't get paid and they don't get clothed and they don't get fed. That's the number one thing. He was probably very good at gathering intelligence. But yes, he was amazingly good at organizing. And if you go to the field at Waterloo and you look across the battlefield, which is quite massive, you notice the points of strategy, or you might not notice the points of strategy, because at first glance it looks like a flat field. But the 33rd Regiment, which is my reenacting regiment, held all day this very tiny bit of ground that was actually very, very slightly higher. And even though it's a slight difference, having to attack from up a slope, or down a slope, I should say, makes a huge difference to morale, to your tactical differences. So he was very, very good at researching the lay of the land and strategizing where he was going to put his men, expecting an awful lot out of the men, but certainly leading from the front, being seen often in battle, checking on his command. And he was generally respected and well liked by the men as well.
Yes, I think he had a certain doer side to his character.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Side. So whereas Nelson would probably be a bit more flamboyant,
yes,
Wellington is very much a kind of stick at it kind of person.
Yeah,
and of course he goes on to have a much longer life. He doesn't die till about 1850, and he becomes prime minister, and later on, so huge long tail. Well, not even a tail. I mean, he's
a long career.
With the high point being Waterloo. So so we've got Nelson, one kind of leader. We got Wellington, another kind of leader for Jane Austen to sort of be aware of. But of course, the big dominant leader of her era was actually over in France. It was Emperor Napoleon, who comes from nothing to rule.
Legend. I think the man pretty much achieved mythical proportions of legend. He's never going to be forgotten. And I would say there's still probably a cult of Napoleon to this day, of people who, yes, he kind of lost the war, but he won in every other way. This is a man who managed to basically abandon his army 3 times, let's not forget, and was still welcomed back with open arms. So I think the number one thing for Napoleon would have to be charisma. As his big thing. He could.
He won the publicity campaign.
He definitely did.
Yeah.
And I think the next one is ambition. My golly, as you say, he came from absolutely nothing and declared himself emperor at the end of it. And you just think, wow, the ambition and the will to do that is absolutely phenomenal.
And he put all his relatives. And put his relatives in.
And put his relatives everywhere. Yeah. So just to sort of, I think the only thing he didn't rule was the waves at that point, and that's why Nelson was so popular, because he held off Napoleon mastering the seas, but Napoleon pretty much ruled everything else for a long time. He obviously inspired enormous loyalty, and I think he was as well as obviously one of the leaders of his day. He was one of the biggest celebrities of his day. He was very canny in that he did things like encouraged inventors. So, for example, something as simple as butter on campaign, it's either going to melt or freeze. So he actually got someone to invent margarine and add oil to the butter so it wouldn't freeze. It's little things like that make a huge difference. He got the court wearing enamel jewelry because Britain basically blockaded a lot of the ports and jewels weren't as available anymore. So he started fashions, and he got fashions for lace, fashions for a French fashion, which is still prevalent today. So he was very canny in seizing an opportunity or looking for the next thing that could help his strategy. So you have to admire that. Whatever else you might think about his politics or his desire to rule everything.
I think one of the interesting things is, whereas, like 20th century conflicts, it'd be hard to find a supporter of Hitler in England after a certain point.
Yes.
Not during the early 1930s, but later on.
Mm.
Napoleon definitely appealed to English radicals.
Oh, yes.
And doing a bit of family research into my husband's family, and we discovered that quite a lot of his relatives back in the sort of 1790s, 1815, were calling their children Napoleon.
Mm.
And the last time in this family where this name was handed down was a military record from the First World War, where they were still calling their sons Napoleon. So, and of course, Byron thought Napoleon was very good news. So there is this appeal that goes across national boundaries in the kind of leader Napoleon was. I think he was an object of admiration.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. But admiration. Okay, so Jane's got a rich landscape of leaders to choose from. But as she says, her own works are these miniatures.
Yeah.
And so the actual leaders she puts into her works aren't on the national scale of like a Thackeray or a Tolstoy. They are people who run an estate or lead the village or the local society, wherever that is.
Yeah.
So this is where we turn to our leading men and the Darcy effect, as I've been calling it. We're going to start with the bad leaders first before we get to Mr. Darcy. So just like in the book, you have to wait for Mr. Darcy's entrance. He's coming. So what about her bad leading men? The first one I thought of, who has a big estate and is hopeless, is Mr. Rushworth.
But is he a leading man, or is he more of a... I've split mine into the good, the bad, and the ugly or indifferent. I think Mr. Rushworth...
I mean, he's supposed to be leading as opposed to he's a central character. You know, he's supposed to be running his estate, but he's bad because he's hopeless. He doesn't.
I think he's like a very enthusiastic toddler, really. And I think Maria, when she's talking to her father about, you know, I'm going to marry him. I know he's not wonderful, but I'm going to marry him because I think he can be easily led. She sees that he can be molded into her own desires, basically. And that's the appeal of him, that he is so poor a leader that he's actually a follower, let's face it.
Yeah, so clearly in Jane Austen's list of things, being easily persuadable away from what's right is a very bad characteristic. I will leave our listeners to work out who maps onto that in the crop of leaders. So what about, sort of by contrast to Rushworth, you've got from the early novel, from Northanger Abbey, you've got General Tilney, who I think he's a general, so he should be a good leader, but actually he's not.
Well, he's described, isn't he, as a tyrant to his children. So he's taken leadership to the extremes. And I think it's a characteristic of a lot of men brought up in certain ages. You are expected to lead, and you are expected to be an absolute ruler. So your word is law to your family, certainly. And his definitely was to his. And that's backed up by, you are the owner of the estate. So you can kick somebody out of your home if they don't agree with you. You are the owner of the purse strings and who inherits what. So you are an absolute monarch in your own little fiefdom in that case. And I think he wasn't... he clearly did not like anyone suggesting there was another way of doing things. So he's an example of somebody who could have been a good and fair leader, but actually has become so monstrous in his leadership that he turns into a tyrant, really.
Yes, his children seem to be more promising in terms of their approach. But you have to remember that the very worst thing that General Tilney does is he kicks out a girl who's, you know, a very young girl, because she's not the heiress he thought she was, and sends her off in the middle of the night in a carriage. So that's the equivalent of, you know, you've got your French exchange student staying with you and you dump them in London and say, right, off you go, find your way home.
Yes, I don't think he even gave her any money. I think Eleanor gave her some money. So it was very, very, it was the exact opposite of being dangerous, yes, and the exact opposite of being a host. So he took her on and treated her to hoping to woo her as a rich heiress for his son, and then just completely dismissed her. And people, I don't think today realize just how badly he treated her. They think, oh well, she had to go home then. They don't think, well, she had to go home with no money, no escort, basically in the wilds where she could have been attacked. Anything could have happened to her, and it's just very lucky that nothing did.
Yeah, and it's a huge embarrassment for the children.
Oh yes, massive. Yeah, so again, he's basically shamed his children by his treatment of it, because they're horrified at his treatment, and Henry rushes to apologize afterwards.
So here's an example of the tyrant, and sadly, you don't have to look too far in the modern landscape to find your tyrant who turns on you when you are not what he expects. We have an example of several really bad churchman leaders. Of course, we've got the one who is the follower. In fact, actually, that seems to be a characteristic of these bad churchmen, like Mr. Elton.
Yeah.
Who is dominated by
his wife,
and then is dominated by his wife.
Yeah,
when he gets there. But there are others that fall into that category. Do you have a bad church?
Yes, well, Mr. Collins is the obvious one, and he's very much a follower again. He's trying to ingratiate himself and is very awed by anyone with more status and money than he has. And then he patronizes people who he considers are beneath him. Yes, I mean, I'm sure Jane Austen had a few examples of her father's church colleagues to have a look at. But again, it's a difficult position, isn't it, in what I would consider the middle classes, is you are dependent on others for your living. And once you retire from that living, you're pretty much dependent on your own funds, if you're lucky enough to have any. And it's interesting that Jane Austen's brother inherited his father's living. I think he took it over anyway, certainly. So Mr. Collins is very aware of his status defined by his patron status, basically. So he's very, very proud of Lady Catherine de Bourgh being the owner of his living, and basically takes that cloak on himself and basically has borrowed status because of it.
We could go through all the different leadership, but I just want to pick up another bad leader, who is John Dashwood, who is the half brother of Eleanor and Marianne, who
again, he's easily persuaded. It's a theme, isn't it, for a lot of the books. So he starts off trying to do good, but very rapidly descends into, oh well, yes, you're absolutely right, my dear. I'll do as you say, and doesn't stand his ground, even though and this is quite a big thing in those days, he's given his promise to his father on his deathbed that he will look after his sisters, and that just gets whittled away to nothing, doesn't it?
I think the key thing there in this theme of leadership is that he doesn't stick to his principles.
No.
Turns out to be a complete straw man. So he might say, oh yes, of course I'll look after my sisters.
Of course I will.
And there's that wonderful conversation which was then done brilliantly in the Emma Thompson adaptation, where it goes from so many thousand a year to
a few chickens visit at Christmas or something. Yes. And Harriet Walter is marvelous in that role.
Yes, they can even help out.
Yes, and just you can just see the persuasion and just be whittled down, and and your poor boy will be left with very little, and there's that poor boy who's obviously got a lot already.
But I thought we're majoring on leading men. When I was thinking about this, it also struck me there was a couple of leading women that are worth looking at in this context of bad leaders. And the most wonderful Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is so brilliantly awful that actually is kind of almost good. A woman in a man's world who basically makes everyone bow and scrape to her, though she's a monster.
But is she a monster? Or is she just someone with an enormous sense of self-worth? She actually invites her vicar and his wife and his hangers-on to several meals at her grand house, and she allows Lizzie Bennet to play the second best piano in the housekeeper's room. So she would just sit
Lucky
being
her.
enormously, gracious to her poor relations or poor neighbours.
Yeah, so I mean, she's not a monster in the sort of wiki. She's got these. She's just so huge. She sucks in all the atmosphere in the room. So when you get somebody else who's got her own charisma, Lizzie, in the same room, it's a fascinating clash because they're really strong, but in different ways. Yeah. And then the other one, which people may not know so much about, is of course Lady Susan, who is. I saw recently there's a new adaptation of Dangerous Liaisons coming out, and Lady Susan is a bit like a Jane Austen version of the sort of Dangerous Liaisons lady.
Yes, I think she's a very interesting character because she has, again, wonderful strategies, and she's like the lady in Vanity Fair. She's all about survival. Yes, Becky Sharp. She's all about survival and making sure she comes out on top. And you could say she's amoral. You could say she's utterly selfish. But you've got to admire her at the same time for managing the situations and the people around her and coming up smelling of roses most of the time.
So she's the leader. She's the leader who is in it for what she can get out of it. I mean, she's a terrible mother. That's where she really loses a lot of sympathy.
Definitely.
Is her daughter is her victim.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can think of leaders like that too. I'm not going to put any, fill in the blank. So, okay, we've talked about the poor leaders, and I think Jane Austen has absolute fun thinking about these people who really are promoted beyond their capabilities.
Oh yeah, we know a lot of people like that.
Yeah, true for every age.
Oh yeah.
Now let's think about the good leaders, and here we get to Mr Darcy and Mr Knightley. I think I've put them at the top of my.
Yeah, I would put them at the top of my food chain as well.
What do you think of Mr Darcy as a leader?
Well, it's quite interesting because you don't really see him as a leader other than of his little clique. You don't really see the land manager and manager of his enormous estates and funds that he must spend some time doing that. He probably has an estate steward, but he will oversee that. And his housekeeper does mention what a good master he is. So if you think of country houses as their own, especially somewhere as large as Pemberley, is basically their own little town or even city, responsible for hundreds of livelihoods around the estate, and the estate is basically its own little world, quite capable of supplying everything it needs. So he is overseeing all of that. So he must, if his employees are speaking well of him, he must be a reasonable leader, whatever his personal qualities at assemblies might come across as.
Yeah, so I think that's right. I think one of the tricks of the book is to move him from a character who stands aloof, stands at the edge, sort of saying, "You're not handsome enough to tempt me," that guy.
Yes.
Where he's on Bingley's turf, not his own turf. And then you get the transition where Lizzie begins to think there might be something different about him because he's spoken of so well by the housekeeper. But he also comes ahead to settle some business with his steward. That's why he's there early. His sister talks about him. So she starts to get the other side to him. And then he swings into action when there is something he can do. He doesn't ask, "Oh, can I help your sister?" He doesn't say he's going to do anything, but he is the one who says, "Right, let's sort this out." He's the one who goes and gets goes off to London, finds Wickham, makes them marry. And so you see that he actually steps forward and saves the day.
Yes, but he doesn't do it in a way that says, "Look at me, now be grateful to me." That's the thing. He does it and he wants it to be secret. So he doesn't want people to know that he's done this. And that's the thing. It's acting without expectation of anything in it for them. And he says he did it for Lizzie ultimately, not for Lydia's sake. But he certainly acted, and again, he probably didn't tell Lizzie he was going to London to search because he may not have been able to find anything, and then he would have raised her hopes for no reason. So I totally sympathise with him. But I think the main aspect of a lot of Jane Austen's heroes, and the hallmark for me of a good leader, is he takes responsibility.
Yes.
He actually says, this is my fault. If I'd actually told people about what happened to my sister earlier, maybe this wouldn't have happened, and I feel responsible for this.
Lizzie also says the same thing. It's my fault. I should have been more open.
Yes.
So they both share that quality, because Lizzie is a sort of female leader within her circle. She's the most lively, she's the playmaker in terms of what goes on in her family very often. So Mr. Knightley, in what way do you see him as being different from Mr. Darcy? They are different types.
Yeah, they're both landowners. They're both managers of estates and things like that. I would say Mr. Knightley is possibly more sociable. He is protective of and wanting Emma to flourish. So from the start, when we meet him, he is a friend of the family. He's very sociable with his small circle around Donwell Abbey. So I think he's a more, when we first meet him, he appears to be warmer, friendlier, more open, willing to have a laugh straight off the bat. Who cried most at the wedding is one of his first lines, and sort of just very gently poking fun at people. So he comes across as someone you could quite happily have a chat with, which Darcy certainly doesn't initially. Darcy initially comes across as someone who's rather reserved, very proud. And I think it's often mentioned about Mr. Knightley that he doesn't wear his status too heavily. He does come across as very approachable and very friendly and a good neighbour.
I think the absolute key for him is that we see him in conjunction with a whole society and different levels of that society. And we see that judgment about people is right most of the time. He says, it's one thing when he says, I was wrong, which is interesting because he admits he was wrong. But he is right about Robert Martin and Harriet Smith being a good match. He's right about you need to be nice to Miss Bates because look at her status compared to yours. And he is also generous enough to say, actually, I was wrong about Jane Fairfax. She was,
and isn't that, again, a characteristic of a lot of Jane Austen's heroes? They are prepared to admit they were wrong. They are prepared to change their mind when presented.
Mr. Darcy was wrong eventually.
Yeah. Edmund Bertram admits he was wrong about his first fiancée, and has a disgust to her ultimately for her treatment of his brother and things like that. So they are prepared to change.
And Captain Wentworth.
Yes, again. He actually goes for a second proposal when another man might have said, that's it, you've had your chances, forget it.
That one's actually an interesting, because it's more like a not so I was wrong. It's more I can see how you were right by your lights.
Yes, it becomes a bit more forgiving and understanding of the situation, I suppose.
It's a maturity.
Yeah,
so I
absolutely.
think that compared to the man-child Rushworth, a good leader is a mature man, woman who can admit they're wrong, who can take responsibility, who judges people with clear sight.
And I think a lot of Jane Austen's heroes as well are considerate, thoughtful, they're acting without wanting praise, protective, I thought, and something that doesn't come up very often, they're dutiful. So again, acting in a very moral way is Edward Ferrars, who basically wants very much to marry Eleanor, but he's given his word in a youthful indiscretion to Lucy Steele, and he's going to be ostracized effectively by his society and possibly without a living, but he still keeps his word, and that's obviously very important to Jane Austen.
So, Kate, Mr. Darcy is obviously everybody's heartthrob. And not everybody, but a lot of people's heartthrob. And thinking about this theme, I just wondered if that is not a huge part of his romantic appeal, because there isn't much physical description of him. Obviously, he's wealthy, but that's not enough. And so what I have in mind is that somewhere there is a romantic part of us that actually likes a safe pair of hands in all of those senses.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I call this the Cinderella principle. Okay, so this is a very obvious romantic trope, which is my favorite fairy story, Cinderella. And at surface, you may say to yourself, well, this how shallow. You fall for a man who's rich and got a title. But at its core, what you're actually falling for is someone who can protect you, someone who will look after you. You're not worried about being impoverished anymore, someone who can give you a good life, and it's a safety thing, it's a shelter thing, which is primal, isn't it? We all want a cave with a fire. So it's actually answering a very primal need, and especially for women in Jane Austen's time, most times in history, the idea of someone who can provide for you and look after you, yes, give you some bit of status, but mainly it's someone the fact that you get on with them is a bonus, really, a lot of the time. But that's something very, very to be admired.
So the safety thing can end up with marrying Mr. Collins.
Yes, and that's a perfectly valid choice that Charlotte Lucas makes, and I think Lizzie has to admit she's made a good choice. Ultimately, when she sees Charlotte Lucas in her own little abode, ordering things just the way she likes it, she has to acknowledge that Charlotte has a point. So I think, again, possibly the reader changes their mind. First of all, they're appalled that poor Charlotte is marrying Mr. Collins, but then they have to acknowledge that she's not.
What was plan B for Charlotte?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, she says what plan B was, and that was sinking property and basically being foisted on her relatives and being dragged on her relatives.
I do think it goes a bit further than that, and I think what it is, and the reason why he is such a fascinating and sort of a character who stays with us, I think it's because the journey takes us on, the book takes us on a journey to see that he is worthy.
Yes.
And then
he's so much more than just Prince Charming. Well, he's the opposite of Prince Charming to begin with, obviously.
Yes.
And that's what makes all Jane Austen's heroes and heroines so fascinating, is they all go on journeys, they all evolve. They don't just stay the same.
This is the trick. This is the absolute heart of it, which is you decide someone's worthy, they look at you and say you are worthy of them. Yeah. So Darcy is much more appealing because he looks around and finds this woman who is, he understands that she is his match, even though so much he told her all the reasons why she didn't suit.
Absolutely.
But he comes to say, actually, you're worthy, and so there's this. That's why it feels such a warm ending, because you get the sense of the puzzle pieces interlocking, and yes, they are a right fit.
Yeah, they both seem to start off at total opposite ends of the spectrum, and then they meet in the middle. And again, the romantic, the essence of romance, if you like, is as I've said before, I think boy and girl meet, keep them apart for 125 pages, but that's the thing, you don't want them to immediately meet and fall in love like possibly Mr. Bingley and Jane do. Because it's very boring as a story, much as you might sympathize with them. You want them to go on a journey ultimately. But it's very interesting because two people who are initially set against each other, gradually, and that's the interest of the book, start seeing similarities as opposed to differences. And as the book was supposed to be called First Impressions, their first impressions change. And that's what is fascinating. And I think it's the idea. I don't think Mr. Darcy changes as such, but I think you are given more insights into his character, and he admits he is wrong, and you see his inner warmth when she goes to visit him at Pemberley. You see him interacting with his sister and being very protective and caring of her. You see his servants talking well about him. She gets a totally different viewpoint. You see him relaxed and happy at home, as opposed to awkward and bored at an assembly, which is not his best side. So it's when he's interacting and he's more relaxed, and he's really warm and welcoming to the gardeners. So she can see that there are at least some aspects of her family that he does approve of. So it's not a complete downer. But he unpeels himself like a little onion, and I think you warm to him just as Lizzie warms to him. Seeing these other facets of his character. You've only seen one very stiff and formal side to begin with, and then he reveals his inner core, if you like, and that's much more appealing.
So I'm going back to the theme, which is leadership. Very often, basically, it's very hard to write a romance without an alpha personality.
But I think that's the thing. Darcy is an alpha personality.
Yeah.
Lizzie is an alpha personality. And it's not that he's towering over her or leading her as, come on, Lizzie, follow me. I think the thing that is most appealing, if most people are honest about the end, when they both come together, is that he is her partner. They are both equal leaders and they are both willing to learn from each other. And that is very, very attractive.
Yeah, exactly. So leadership actually in romance means joint leadership is key for a happy ending. Really.
Yeah, I would say so. It's not really, well, people would often argue about various romance tropes, certainly from the 70s, of woman gets dominated by man and is grateful for it, kind of thing. And that's not sexy anymore, to be honest, and it never really was sexy to begin with. So I think the idea of a partnership of both, you know, you might have different strengths and weaknesses, but a good leader enhances the people they are leading. I would say that's the sign of a really good leader. They're not afraid of someone with other strengths than themselves. They use that to make everyone stronger, you know, and they actually utilize those strengths. They don't put them down for them.
So unfortunately, Kate, I've got to bring you from 1800 back to present day. And the question we'll end with is, what would Jane do? What would she think of our current leaders and our models of leadership that we have now?
I think there would be a massive political novel in the making there of you know, what would Jane have written about politics if she lived long enough to, because it wasn't something she would have been aware of. It, she would have read newspapers, she would have heard reports of the time, and people would have talked over it just like we talk over it today, of all the local political scandals and things, but it wasn't a circle she necessarily moved in at so much. But I think she certainly would have been amazed at the rises and falls going on in very quick rapidity going on. There would have been a lot of food for caricature, shall we say.
Yeah. I think she would have had very little time for those leaders who are man-childs.
Very little time. Well, as you can see, I think she would have thought a lot of them
leaving
like
you
Walter Elliot. Yes. And I think, again, for me, the characteristic of a lot of her bad leaders is selfishness. You know, people who are, well, I'm all right, so everybody else can go hang. And if you look at General Tilney, Frederick Tilney, Wickham, Willoughby, Sir Walter Elliot is a monster of selfishness. Everybody around them is affected by them, but they don't care. And it's just, well, as long as I'm all right and I've got my money and my prestige, you can, the rest of you, I'm just indifferent about, really. You're just tools to prop up me.
So we want Darcys and Knightleys, men and women who take responsibility and listen and can admit mistakes. That's who we want. But possibly we want them elected to those positions as opposed to do it by, you know, different era. Okay, well, Kate, thank you so much for joining me on the discussion of leadership.
More than welcome. It's always been fun. And
let's have a quick dip into Jane Austen news.
Yeah,
do you have
a roundup? I have a little bit of news, which is the ever popular Jane Austen Literary Foundation. They're having a Jane Austen tea for literacy between the 31st of October and the 31st of December. If you look on the literacy website, it's Jane Austen Literacy Foundation website. There's special prizes to be won for having a tea and raising some money for the foundation. And one of the special prizes, which I would love to win, is a silhouette session with Charles Burns. And if you've ever seen Charles Burns at the Jane Austen Festival, he snips with his scissors and in minutes creates a wonderful silhouette for you. So that's a lovely prize. There's various balls going on throughout the country, and certainly in 2023. So look out for those. I know it's certainly in my area of West Yorkshire, there's the Bankfield Museum Ball, and that has the Pemberley Players playing at it, who are a lovely group of musicians and callers. So tickets are on sale for that. But there's more balls than ever before. So assemblies all over. So, you know, put in assemblies or balls in my area, or Jane Austen dance groups in my area, and see what you can find, because they're all kicking off everywhere. And I gather you have some authorly news to share with us?
Yes. So I've been writing this series, Jane Austen Investigates.
Yes.
And it is, I think it's available now, but I'm launching it properly in December. It's called The Convict's Canal, and it's inspired by, inspired by Pride and Prejudice. I've been following the sequence of the novels in the sort of what underlies this, particularly the first impressions idea. And how this came about was, I was thinking, well, what was happening? What big thing was happening in Jane Austen's era, beginning with C? Because the first one is the next one was Burglar's Ball. And I thought, well, C. I was thinking canals. And this is the era of the huge canal expansion. And I live near the Oxford Canal, and Jane Austen's brother was at college in Oxford at the time, and they were just finishing this huge canal project. And part of it was dug out by the convicts from Oxford jail. So I thought, all of that is really interesting story material. So if you want to find out about the canal mania, sort of the penal system at the time, and what Jane Austen would do investigating all of that, then this is a children's novel suitable from 8 to 108.
88, yes, at least.
Oh,
no, I get a lot of pleasure. I know it's supposedly a children's novel, but certainly the ones I've read, I get enormous pleasure smirking to myself in smug satisfaction of picking out all the Jane Austen matches that you can find that you can match up to the books.
There's lots of jokes interwoven.
In-joke.
There on the 17th of December, which my publisher tells me is Jane Austen Day, which I think is a birthday.
Every day is Jane Austen Day for us.
We're actually doing a treasure hunt on Oxford Canal. So if you live in the Oxford area, look out. We're palling up with Waterstones in Oxford, and there will be free books hidden along the canal.
Free books! I'm there.
Yeah, free books.
I'll bring my canal expert with me.
So that should be fun, and that's the 17th of December. Lovely. Well, thanks so much, Kate, for chatting with me.
Always a pleasure.
Tune in next time when we again discuss what would Jane do about the next crisis that hits us.
What will it be, readers?
To be continued. Thank you.
To be continued. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.